The Wednesday Bookmark on Family Radio CHRI. Each week we introduce you to something new, something that'll make you think, something that might change your life. Here's this week's author interview on the Wednesday Bookmark on Family Radio CHRI.
Joining us this week for the Wednesday Bookmark is Kait Warman. Kait is a California-based relationship coach, online educator, speaker, and host of the Heart of Dating podcast. This is her first book. We're going to talk about Thank You for Rejecting Me this morning, transform pain into purpose, and learn to fight for yourself. So appreciate your time this morning, Kait.
Thank you so much, Brock. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Let's begin Christmas 2000 when you were 11 years old. Tell us about what happened that Christmas and how it ties in also with your decision to years later bust out a neon bikini at the beach.
I love that question. And I got to say this because you guys are in Canada. This all happened, that story in chapter 1 of my book actually happened in Canada, okay, in Ontario. So just want to point that out. I'm actually originally from Canada, so kind of fun fact there on the side. But yeah, this story, so my book is all about rejection. But what I really wanted to do was I started the book talking about ways in which we self-reject. And a lot of times there's been things spoken over us that have created lies and self-limiting beliefs in our minds that we don't even know that they're there. They've just become so natural and normal to us. So when I was 11 years old, we were taking a family portrait, and my Aunt Deb at the time went and looked at the photos, and she said to me, "Caitlin, why can't you just smile normal?" And this little moment, which of course she didn't really mean that much harm from it. She, whatever that is going on in her life. But for me, that moment was this heartbreaking moment that created insecurity in my mind about myself, my attraction, and my body. And that little lie compounded upon itself to then create a slew of insecurities growing up in adolescence and into my teen years and into then my adult woman years. And here's the thing, Brock, is that there's not one person on this planet that is immune from body rejection, body shame, and insecurity. Even guys, women, we talk a lot about body shame, but guys as well. And so for me, this was a huge moment and one of the biggest things in my life that has created a lot of insecurity when it comes to my body. So what that looks like for me later on in life is having to learn that these self-limiting beliefs, things that I believed potentially since being a young girl, are things in my mind that I have the power to partner with God to renew my mind, to transform my mind, and start seeing my body and myself the way that God sees me, which is a process. And I talk about that way more in the book because there's a lot to that.
And speaking of self-hatred, you introduced this concept in chapter 2 of shame scarves. What are shame scarves?
Yes. So self-hatred, when I say that word, often someone's like, well, Kait, I don't just hate myself. And sure, maybe you don't hate yourself entirely, but I'll bet you that you dip your toes into the waters of self-hatred. I don't know a single person who does it. And what this looks like typically are the ways in which we berate ourselves, where we are like, you shouldn't have done that, or you know better, or you're not interesting, or you're not beautiful, or my gosh, why did you mess up there? You're such a failure. We do this in our own mind. And that's self-hating mindsets. Those are self-hating dialogues. The shame scarves I talk about in the book are layers of different shame moments in our life. So maybe even that moment with my Aunt Deb was a layer that created a shame that was over me. Like I should be ashamed of my body. I should be ashamed of my smile. And those little shame scarves get piled up over time, taking us away from our true identity as God intended for us to be, as pure and holy and wonderful and unique. And so because of these shame scarves, we learn to have different coping mechanisms. We function in certain ways that are potentially, some of them are good ways, some of them are also unhealthy ways. And we have to be able to go through the deconstruction of what are the things that have caused me shame and how has that piled up through time so that I can come back to the wholeness and fullness of who I am in God.
Okay, this is a really tough question, but I very much want to get your thoughts on this. You rightfully point out that there's a pretty big gap even between what Christians are taught and what they're actually doing when it comes to sex. So if that's true, and I think it is, then how do we go about fighting sexual shame, and how can we close that gap? You know what I mean?
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of teachings, and I want to give the church credit in that they're doing the best they can to teach, the abstinence before marriage. I just believe, and I've personally experienced, that a lot of those messaging, especially from the purity culture kind of movement back in the day, that's still lingering to this day, some of the messaging can be shame-filled. And when we grow into adulthood, we really need to understand the why behind why we're doing something. And so when you slap on things like don't have sex until marriage, or else you'll die, or else this, that, and the other, it creates a lot of fear in our system and creates a lot of shame inherently for if you have any thought that's sexual, or if you engage in anything, you immediately are overwhelmed with shame. And so what you have are Christians on two ends of the spectrum. You have people that are abstaining from sex and doing nothing, but because they're so fearful of what sex is and their sexuality, they are so disconnected from this inherent beautiful thing that God has created, which is their sexual desire and sexuality. And, if we break it down further, Brock, sex isn't just between a man and a woman in marriage. Really, sex, if you break it down, is connection between people. And it's that need to be intimately close with others. And so we've put a lot of sort of thoughts on this idea, and that's because of potentially some of the teachings when we were younger. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is potentially somebody who heard the teachings, but then they still engage sexually, but because, oh my gosh, this was so against the rules, and I can't imagine what my community or my pastor would say if they knew I did these things. Those individuals usually live in a pit of shame and try to hide, or they go down a downward spiral, or they get addicted to pornography, what have you. And what we need to do is have a loving place and compassionate place for people to ask questions, to really understand that their sexual desire, their sexuality is good, that it was created by God, that it is a beautiful and holy thing. And out of that outworking of truly understanding that for ourselves as individuals, we can then build up a sexual ethic and a system that can better help us walk through abstinence while we're dating as singles.
That was so well put. You also talk about the dating world. You talk about the fear of abandonment. You refer to abandonment as a bully. Our time is running short. We'll have to skip over some of that stuff, but I want to get to this. At one point, you moved across the country to L.A. to take a job as a senior buyer at a luxury fashion company, but things were more difficult than you expected, and you talk about this in the book. Discuss what you learned just from that whole experience.
Yeah, so I moved across the country. I got that job, but what I realized was that I was so adamantly putting my identity in what I was doing, and almost like my relationship with God or my relationship with others was built on accolades. Well, if I can do this, if I can be the best at this, if I have the best job, if I do the best here, then I'll be loved and accepted. And that was exactly what it came to with work. And I moved to LA, actually, funny enough, to get a slower pace of life. Before that, I was in New York City. But what happened in LA was I actually did not at first get a slower pace of life. I ended up working more hours than I was in New York, exhausting myself further. And it came to one night where I was working on a Sunday night at midnight. My roommate came out and asked me, "Kate, what are you doing?" And the lights were off. I was still working, and I just started crying. And it was in that moment that night that I asked God, I was like, "God, I don't have the strength, I feel like, to leave this job on my own. I think I put myself too much, my identity too much in this job and what it means for me. But I am suffering over here, and I need a way out. I need a new start." And 5 days later, my CEO called me into her office, let me go from the job, which was the first time I'd been laid off. It was shocking, lots of tears. But it was in that moment, it was a pivotal moment where God redirected me. And of course, the journey wasn't easy, but eventually, if I hadn't left fashion and became an entrepreneur, I would never have been led eventually to where I am today, talking to singles about dating. And so really the reality there is that work does not equal worthy. You are not worthy because of the work that you do, especially the tangible work, but also to remember that God is redirecting you through every closed door. And that is what I had to realize in that instance, because leaving that job was really a hard thing for my heart because I had put so much time, energy, effort into it. But I had no idea that years later, God would bring me here today to write a book and get to coach people in dating.
That feels like a good note to close with. We're talking again about Thank You for Rejecting Me, Transform Pain into Purpose, and Learn to Fight for Yourself. Kait Warman, our guest this week for the Wednesday Bookmark. Really enjoyed the book. Thanks so much, Kait.
Thanks, Brock.
The Wednesday Bookmark on Family Radio CHRI. To find out more about this week's bookmark or hear the author interview again or to discover previous books highlighted on the Wednesday Bookmark, visit bookmark.chri.ca.